Welcome back, everyone. So on the one hand, I have a bunch of Bible studies up my sleeve, but what we really wanted to do, folks, especially because I feel I've been hearing much too much today, a sound that gets on my nerves. My voice. So we wanted to have a much more interactive part than what we've had until now, and I guess Pastor Mark had to step out. So
He'll be here.
Okay, until he gets back. So let's kick it off, especially because there's a really, really important question that I don't remember your name is. Natalia has to ask, and when she asked it to me during the break, I started answering, and then I said, this is really much too important for us to just have this conversation privately. Not that she doesn't deserve an answer by herself, but I figured that everyone else would profit by our discussing it more broadly. So if you wouldn't mind, please.
My question was, when you said all people will return to Israel or Jerusalem, who are those people when you meant all? Is that just believers, all people, and about when that time will come?
Okay. So,
Thank you.
So while I can't tell you the timetable because we have an old saying: the ones who know aren't talking, and the ones who are talking don't know. But with respect to the question of who is it who comes back, that's something that really strikes at the root of a lot of what we've been discussing, and in particular, with respect to what we just discussed now regarding unfulfilled prophecies, or prophecies that may be fulfilled in ways that are different from what we might expect. And I'd like to focus in particular on what we read in both Ezekiel chapter 38 and in Zechariah chapter 14, both of which describe a battle against the Lord in Jerusalem. An interesting question is whether these are two descriptions of the same battle or two different battles, and the truth is there are different approaches to that question among our commentators. But what I'll certainly stress is, in either case, we see this showdown of the enemies of the Lord against God and his people taking place in Jerusalem. And I always like to comment in this regard. If someone were to ask, is it possible that this battle might be waged as an inner conflict in each and every individual, and in each and every individual, the forces of godliness will prevail over the forces of godlessness, so there won't need to be an external battle because everyone will come onto God's side. Is it possible? I believe it's possible. I believe it's possible because God endows each and every one of us with free will. That's one of the greatest gifts that God gives us, because that means he's giving us responsibility. And since everyone is endowed with free will, that's really free, we can all choose to return to God. Having said that, on the one hand, indeed, as we discussed with respect to the story of Jonah, we won't say that would be a violation of what we read in Ezekiel chapter 38 and Zechariah chapter 14, for the same reason that I said, we read in Jonah, another 40 days and the Nineveh will be overturned. It was overturned because they overturned to God. So is it possible that we could read those prophecies in Ezekiel chapter 38 and Zechariah chapter 14 as prophecies that describe that inner conflict that's taking place in each and every individual and everyone will return to God? Again, I think it's possible. do I think that's what's playing out in the world today? Oh, no, definitely not. I mean, it could. Because, free will is really free, and that means that in a flash, someone could really be transformed. And I have no doubt that the day before Jonah showed up in town, no one would have looked at Nineveh and said they can return to God. It's hopeless. It wasn't hopeless. It needed that flashpoint that ultimately led to the transformation of Nineveh. Again, it can happen again, but I look at the world around us, and if anything, the way things look, the way things appear headed, there are definitely forces amassing against God, against godliness, against God's people. And again, the way things look for now, I'm not a prophet, but the way things look for now, the world is gearing up for that final showdown. And one of the points that I emphasize in that essay that I have for distribution on the table is, I think more and more we feel that what is disappearing is that mid-ground of the fence sitters. Everyone is summoned to choose. Are you with God or without God? And the forces that are without God are unequivocally growing stronger and more numerous. But I believe the forces that are with God are also growing stronger. And the fence sitters are disappearing because ultimately everyone is going to be summoned to choose which side are you on. And it's not like in the old days when it was a boundary line that ran between nations. Here the boundary line runs even within families because every individual has access to all the information. It's all out there. We live in the information age, and everyone can choose. Am I on God's side or on the opposite side? And when that process of choosing is truly complete, and when I say truly complete, that means that all those who are on God's side are really on God's side. Yeah. That is, not halfway, lackadaisical, every Monday and Wednesday, but not Tuesdays and Thursdays, or I'll be on God's side as long as it's not going to impinge on my flesh pots, my conveniences in life, when it's really on God's side, as opposed to the ones who aren't. Then I think the stage will be set for that final battle. And I feel this is so important to talk about, precisely because, for me personally, I feel this is integral in my ministry of bringing Jews and Christians to stand together, because, when we look out at the world and we see all these forces of godlessness against which we are arrayed, I'm not fazed by the fact that the forces of godlessness seem to be so much more numerous than we are. I'm not fazed by that because of what the prophet Elisha, exactly, what Elisha says to his youth when the forces of Aram are arrayed round about the city of Dotan. They want to take Elisha captive, and his youth, his attendant, gets up in the night and he sees all of these forces surrounding the city, and he says, Aha, Adoni, Eicha Naaseh. Oh, whoa, my Lord, what are we going to do? And Elisha says, we've got him outnumbered. The only thing he's beseeching God is not for being saved, because that's a foregone conclusion. Just let him see. Let the young man see. Open up his eyes that he may see. And God opened up the eyes of the youth, and he saw that the mountains were filled with horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha, and indeed, they had him outnumbered. When you're on God's side, you're always in the majority, even if you think you're all alone. So it's not the numbers that worry me. It's when you think which side in this epic battle seems to be much better organized and more united. Ouch. That is, the forces of godliness throw up walls among them. Because we're not the same thing, and we're not. Without appreciating that there's so much more that unites us than that divides us. And I believe what God is summoning us to do is to stand together for His glory in order to broadcast a message that can transform the world. Because, you know, the only weapon that we have at our disposal is education. There's no better way to educate than setting an example. What a powerful message could we broadcast if Jews and Christians would stand together in broadcasting the message of God. What a powerful message. To transform the whole world. And that's why I'm praying, that we should indeed be able to stand together. You know, I always like to comment that a lot of folks will say that Jews and Christians stand together because we face common existential threats, which on the one hand is, of course, true. There are a lot of threats out there, all those forces of godlessness that we talked about. But I'd like to put a different spin on these things. Perhaps the reason that God is giving us all these existential threats is to get us to stand together, so that when all these threats will be but a dim memory, we'll still be standing together for His glory. And that's a powerful message. So we stand together on this. Not only we believe in God, that's not enough to say. We believe that God revealed His will in His word here. That's a profoundly powerful platform upon which we stand together and through which we need to communicate a message to the whole world out there. You know, who will be saved? I remember several years ago, I was giving a talk in a church in Osnabrück, Germany. And I was talking about the kingdom of God. And there was a sweet little old lady who raised her hand to say, I'm not looking forward to the kingdom of God. I have God's kingdom in my heart. So, how do you respond? So first you say a really quick prayer to God to put the right words in your mouth. And the words that came out were, it's wonderful that you have the kingdom of God in your heart. But I read in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6, I have given you as light of the nations that my salvation will be to the end of the earth. So it's wonderful that God's kingdom is in your heart, but if you aren't bringing that message to the end of the earth, you're not doing your job. We still need to convey that message all the way out to the end of the earth. And I think it's also part of what we need to be doing before the world will be ready to bear witness to the establishment of God's kingdom. So we got to get to work. So that's why I felt that your question was so important, because to appreciate this message is really just so foundational. It's not an abstraction. It's something that we need to integrate and actualize in our own lives. And to be constantly on the lookout for how I can actualize that in my own life. I mentioned to Pastor Lance before, we have a saying in Ethics of the Fathers by Rabbi Tarfon, it's not upon you to finish all the work, but you aren't free to exempt yourself from it. We're not going to be able to go the whole 9 yards on our own. Ultimately, that's God's problem. But God is giving us a charge to be His junior partners and to do the most we can. And what we always need to be checking is, are we doing that? Are we doing the best we can on behalf of God's kingdom?
I have a quick question that's kind of off topic, but you talked about free will. Do you think there still will be free will in the Olam Haba?
That's a fascinating question. I think we need to explain the background here. That is, Pastor Mark invoked Olam Haba, the world to come. The world to come is an expression that has more than one meaning when it is employed. Of course, this is an expression that comes post-Talmudic. In post-Talmudic literature, that is, post-biblical. In Talmudic and Midrashic literature, post-biblical, as first of all evident in the employment of the word olam, because olam in biblical Hebrew means forever. It is in Talmudic parlance that olam takes on the additional meaning of the world, the universe. If we ask why, and I think this is also relevant with respect to the question, what's the etymology of the word olam? All the Hebrew experts know that in biblical Hebrew, every word has a three-letter root. The three-letter root of olam is alam, ayin, lamed, mem, which means hidden, concealed. So of course you could appreciate why forever is olam, because you don't see forever. You have a belief in forever, but it's always out of view. And when post-biblically olam comes to be the term for world, there's the realization that you don't see the world either. You only catch a partial glimpse, but the world in its totality is also concealed, is also out of view. And that inevitably also has implications with respect to what we say about Olam Haba, the world to come, or alternatively, the world that is coming. We have another ancient saying in our tradition of the rabbis that all the prophets prophesied exclusively concerning the Messianic era. But as for the world to come, no eye has seen it except yours, God. It's a realm that's completely beyond. And inevitably, the question, what does that mean? And I realize I'm taking a somewhat expansive view of the question in order to really wrap our minds around this. What does that mean that the prophets prophesied about the Messianic era, but not about the world to come? Where parenthetically, I'll note a pastor friend of mine said that if you don't understand the difference between the Messianic era and the world to come, then you won't be able to understand the book of Revelations, which is part of your Bible, not part of mine, but it's important to bear in mind that the authors of Christian scripture knew about these concepts very well because they were all schooled in Judaism, right, of course. So why can the prophets prophesy about the Messianic era and not about the world to come? Because, after all, prophets, by definition, are freed from the limits of time and space. They can see other times, they can see other places. We already noted the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 40 is brought to Jerusalem in the Spirit of the Lord, and he doesn't just see a different place because he's still in Babylon. He sees a different time because he sees the temple of the future rebuilt. So prophets aren't limited by time and space. But prophecy is an experience. You cannot experience something that is completely divorced from your conceptual frame of reference. The Messianic era is an extension of this world. The world to come is not. It's something that's far beyond what we can imagine in this world altogether. Yeah, I mean, on some plane, it is the culmination of this world, but on a completely different plane. And so, inevitably, I'm going to say, what's the world to come actually going to be like? When we get there, we'll know. But at the same time, what I'm going to state is, you know, when we read in Deuteronomy, in chapter 30, verse 6, God your Lord will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love God your Lord with all of your heart, with all of your soul, that you may live. What is that circumcision of the heart? There's at least two levels, if not more, upon which we need to consider the answer to that question. First, I feel compelled to note that we read about circumcision of the heart in an earlier passage in Deuteronomy, that is, in Deuteronomy in chapter 10, verse 16, we read, "You shall circumcise the foreskin of your hearts, and your necks not harden, not stiffen anymore." So inevitably I need to ask, the circumcision of the heart, is it something that we do, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16, or is it something that God does to us, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6? It's a major question, right? So, what's the answer? Yes. Exactly. The answer is yes. Exactly. We do it because that's the greatest summons that God gives us as his junior partners to take responsibility and to employ our free will in order to transform ourselves. The most critical difference between a human being and an animal is, an animal can make technical, material changes in its environment. A beaver can dam up a lake. Obviously, elephants can knock down trees. Only a human being can transform his world by his free will, by changing who he is, by changing one's character, by changing one's relationship with God. It's the greatest gift that God gives us as human beings. Yes?
Saying that, does that also mean the our tongue? Because what we speak will come forth words too of love, of hate.
But what we speak is always going to be derivative of what's going on inside. So unquestionably, the core. When we say heart here, we're just not just we don't just refer to the thumper. We're talking about the core of our existence. Yeah. If that changes, then everything changes. And that change needs to come first and foremost from within ourselves. With respect to what happens then. So, on the one hand, we understand the fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6, as pertaining not to the world to come, but to the Messianic era. In the Messianic era, this circumcision of the heart takes place. But it doesn't mean that we lose our free will. That means that we're altogether functioning on a different level of behavior. We have no longer the desire to act in a corrupt state that so characterizes life in this world.
How does another verse came to my mind in Ezekiel? In the Messianic times, the temple is rebuilt and they keep the Passover. And in Ezekiel it says, no one can eat the Passover if they're uncircumcised in their heart. Who is going to be the one to judge if a person's heart is uncircumcised?
Well, ultimately, obviously that's something that the commandments of God we all are duty bound to keep. The truth is that this is something that doesn't only pertain to Ezekiel. In our understanding of the commandment of the Paschal offering, even in Exodus, in the leading up to the first Passover, if one has become estranged from his Father in heaven, he doesn't bring the Paschal offering. This is an imperative that pertains to each and every one of us, and it's part of the responsibility that God imposes on each and every one of us. So, again, I'm going to state, in the Messianic era, do we have free will? Yes. Do we feel the same draw to sin that we feel in this world? No. But you also asked about the world to come, and I'm going to say the world to come is a completely different level of existence. And on that plane, one who is part of the world to come, part of God's kingdom, is on a completely different level of existence.
The one thing I have found at least one verse that talks about the world to come. And that is in the last verses of Isaiah 66. And in Isaiah 66, it says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall, Israel's seed and your name remain." So this is after the Messianic reign. This is
we still apply that to the Messianic era.
even that, with the new
Yes.
heavens and the new earth.
Yes,
You
yes.
apply that to the Messianic era. Okay,
Yes.
then that takes care of that question.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, no, that is. Again, our tradition is that the Messianic era, on the one hand, is essentially continuous with what takes place in this world. But in keeping with biblical metaphor, we can speak of a new heavens and new earth also. We can speak of a transformation, because again, if that circumcision of the heart is something that ultimately is fulfilled in the Messianic era, when you have a circumcised heart, you look out at the heavens and the earth, you see a whole different world.
Oh, yeah. Totally. Does anyone have any more questions? This is kind of a question and answer time for
Yeah.
either Rabbi Chaim or me. Anybody have any other questions? Going once? Going twice?
Yes. There's no such thing as off topic.
Because you obviously have a heart for Israel and also
I have a heart for Israel.
For-
No,
for
he
Jew-
does.
for Jew and
I'm
Gentile.
just trying to follow orders.
Jew and Gentile, and your mission that God's called you to is to try to bridge the gap between Jew and Gentile, the Christian who has a circumcised heart, who's following the Lord and is seeking Him, and understands the connection between Jew and Gentile. But you're trying to bridge that gap. We understand. So my question, though, is, are you from a Orthodox heritage? I understand there's a bunch of sects of Orthodox, and there, right?
Sex is, I think it is an overstatement, because since normative Judaism is defined far more in terms of one's fidelity to the commandments of God in the Torah, we're all really the same thing.
Sure.
That is, there are minor differences of custom and the like, but what really informs one's fidelity to the commandments is what defines someone as, I hate to use labels, but what would define someone as Orthodox. The way I would express it perhaps most aptly is, returning to Deuteronomy chapter 30, from verse 15. "Behold, I have placed before you this day life and the good, and death and evil. That I am commanding you this day to love God your Lord, to go in His ways, to keep His commandments, His statutes, and His ordinances. Then you will live and multiply, and God your Lord will bless you in the land that you are coming to possess." And a couple of verses afterwards, "I have called heaven and earth to testify this day. Life and death I have placed before you, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your seed might live, to love God your Lord, to hearken to His voice, to be adherent to Him, because He is your life and the length of your days, to dwell upon the land that God is swearing to your forefathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them." In other words, it's really more than anything else about how one lives one's life.
Sure. But I guess where I was going with this, because I haven't even got to the meat of my question yet.
Oh, sorry, please.
Oh, no problem. I can have tendency to stray off with a bunch of questions. So
Right.
anyway, do you get challenges from fellow Jews in Israel concerning your mission here to bridge the gap between Jew and Gentile, and reaching out to the Gentile in the way you do?
It's a great question. And while, of course, there are folks who don't understand what it is that I'm doing. I would have to say all of the recoil, all of the opposition revolves around one major issue, which is the issue of proselytization. That is, I know there are many Christians today who have renounced the agenda of trying to convert the Jews, but there are also those who have not. And that aspect of missionizing, of trying to lure Jews on one level or another to embrace Christian belief, is more than any other what results in a lot of kicking back, not just in Orthodox circles, but in all Jewish circles. Because, first of all, needless to note, it is evocative of the forced conversions of most of the last 2 millennia. Forced conversions aren't going on nowadays, but they certainly weren't until fairly recently. And second of all, because more than anything else, well, I'll tell you, I completely appreciate that my Christian brothers who would have me adopt Christian beliefs today may be motivated by genuine love. But it's a love without respect. It's treating Jews, as a bunch of godless pagans who need to be introduced to God. So besides the obvious issue that if you actually read the Bible, you see that God sent Israel to introduce him to the world, we can't stand together on the basis of love without respect. It has to be both love and respect. And in the same vein, I will emphatically state, I don't have any agenda to try to persuade any of you or any of the people in my audiences to become Jewish. Because I believe that God has given you your mission and you're doing what you need to do. I'll express it in Jewish terms, through the Noahide covenant in order to attain personal salvation and share in everlasting life and contribute to the redemption of the world. I realize you see your redemption in different terms, but I'm telling you, I have no agenda to try to convert you. It's a challenge for us to hear a reciprocal message from our Christian brothers toward us. Many have met that challenge, others have not, and that's more than anything else what is still a very fraught point with respect to a relationship between Jews and Christians. I'll just maybe add to that one additional point, which I very keenly feel, and that is, broadly speaking, since the war, World War II, Jews and Christians have increasingly come together. But, the way I like to express it is, we come into the same room, but all too often we really don't. Because since religious identity has been such a contentious issue, so we feel compelled to come into the room and leave our religious identity outside. Problem is, if I come into a room and I leave my religious identity outside, I'm still outside. And I know my Christian brothers, if they leave their religious identity outside, are also still outside. So who's in the room? The elephant. Exactly, the elephant. The elephant. The great big elephant is this issue of religious identity that everyone is trying to sidestep the elephant, and we end up with only the elephant being in the room. Excuse me. Pardon me. Pardon me. We've done that before. Okay, but having stated that, then recognizing that we need to figure out how to come into a room together, and inevitably we need to figure out how to come to the room together. Okay, so we're not going to be at one another's throats because we're civilized, but without being at one another's souls is a challenge, and it's a challenge I feel that more and more of us are addressing together. Yeah. In that atmosphere of mutual love and respect. And I believe that transforms the world and paves the way for the kingdom.
And I think the reason why the Jews don't want to proselytize, the last time
Look, the truth, the point, the point is well taken. This is a painful and embarrassing episode for me to recall, but I think it's something that also packed an important message collectively for us. Namely, I say this with profound embarrassment, there was one time in Jewish history where Jews forcibly converted another people. They were the Edomites under the reign of John Hyrcanus, the Hasmonean king, where Edom was converted to Judaism and all males in Edom were circumcised. Fast forward, so Pastor Mark notes that the most famous descendant of that forced conversion was Herod, and one of many points upon which we Jews and Christians can agree was Herod was bad news. But I'm going to add an additional dimension that over the years I've come to appreciate more and more deeply. One of the great medieval Bible commentators from Spain was Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra. And he grapples with a tradition that we have that conflates Edom with Rome, which he notes is historically untenable. Because apropos of the event that we just discussed, the forced conversion of the Edomites to Judaism, in the great revolt of Judea against the Roman Empire, the Jews were fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Edomites against the Romans because the Edomites were Jews. They certainly weren't the Romans. So what was the meaning of this tradition? Essentially, what Rabbi Abraham proposes is, it isn't the Roman Empire. It's the Holy Roman Empire. That is, what ended up happening, says Rabbi Abraham, is the early church attracted Edomite converts. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. An old student of mine directed me to the story of the Judeo-Christian community that existed in Jerusalem until 67, 68, until just before the Great Revolt. When they left Jerusalem, which was in itself very problematic in terms of the cohesiveness between the Jews and the Christians, because they left Jerusalem on the eve of the Great Revolt. They crossed the Jordan and what? Pella. Wow. We're on the same page. Okay. And they set up a community in Pella, which was for centuries a Judeo-Christian community. Indeed, so much so that the bishop of Pella was, I suppose by the community's rules, someone who was circumcised. This went on for centuries. There was a Judeo-Christian center in Transjordan. And inevitably, if you ask, who were they attracting? What Jews were there in Transjordan? The Jews they were attracting were inevitably Edomites, because those were the only Jews who were living in Transjordan at the time. So the Edomites became a kind of germination point for the early church. Varying the metaphor, they were the leaven that made the bread to rise. And it hits me that, so once in Jewish history, Jews forcibly converted another people, and that other people germinates Christianity that engages in forced conversion of Jews for the next 2 millennia. And maybe also, maybe, the Jews treated the Edomites as second-class citizens, which may have made them attracted to this new religion that would treat them for the first time as first-class citizens, indeed as Jews, and the emergent church treats Jews as second-class citizens for most of the next 2 millennia. Now,
Antioch is right up there.
okay, but in any case, what I'll certainly emphasize is, on the one hand, this doesn't exonerate anyone, but it does drive home the realization that God has his ledgers and God balances his books. And maybe to express this, I'm hesitating, but to express this in even more Greisly terms. And I share this with profound shame and remorse, but also with respect to Edom, Seir. We read in Chronicles 2, chapter 25, Amaziahu grew strong and led his people, and they went to the valley of Salt, and he smote the people of Seir, who are the Edomites. He smote 10,000. Well, that's war. It happens. Yeah, but the next verse, and 10,000, the people of Judah took captive alive, and they brought them to the head of the cliff and cast them down from the head of the cliff, and they were all split open. And the Midrash in Lamentations says, and God says, "What are you doing?" And for this, it was decreed that the temple would be destroyed and Israel would be exiled from its land. In other words, again, not exonerating anyone at all. God has his ledgers. He balances his books. There is a historical accounting that needs to be reckoned with. And I feel compelled to add, spilling my guts if I may, an additional dimension here. That is, my wife and I have often encountered in our travels Christians who would come to us in all earnestness and beg us for forgiveness for the sins of the church against the Jews over the course of the last 2 millennia. And as you could well imagine, it's a very awkward moment because on the one hand, we can't forgive a crime that wasn't committed against us personally. We weren't the victims. What are we going to do? But on the other hand, the people who are asking for forgiveness didn't do anything wrong. That is, they didn't commit these crimes. And it is foundational for us, as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, the fathers shall not be put to death for the sons, nor the sons be put to death for the fathers. Every man dies by his own sin. So, if you're not guilty, you're not going to die. And on the one hand, I would emphasize this point. But on the other hand, I realized all the time, there's something missing from that formulation. Because there's a reason they're coming and saying what they're saying. And if I can make a proposition that I'm saying jointly for all of us, there is no such thing as inherited guilt. Toss that out the window. Exactly. But there is such a thing as group responsibility. Yeah. What does group responsibility mean? It means that if I identify with a group, then I can't identify halfway. I can't say I identify with the good things the group did and just simply ignore the bad. I have to own up to everything that is part of the legacy of the group with which I identify. And that means that simultaneously, even as I emphasize, as I reiterate, there's no such thing as inherited guilt, I have to own up to the responsibilities of the group. What does that mean to own up to the responsibilities of the group? Well, it means to recognize that there was a problem here and that I need to do my utmost to redress that problem. Not because I'm guilty, but because I share in that group responsibility. And that brought me to what to me is really a transformative revelation. I'm going to express it very harshly. We are all of us prisoners of history, meaning that there are innumerable events that took place before we even came on the scene that stick us in a certain groove, and we're prisoners of that. And when we own up to that historical burden, God does a miracle, and He lets us out of jail, and He releases us from the prison, which is really just an extraordinary idea to wrap our minds around. And it's so transformative on every plane. It's not a matter of inherited guilt. It's a matter of recognizing that we have the wherewithal, and this is the extraordinary grace of God in giving us this opportunity to be able to turn a new page in a blood-soaked book of history. And to turn that page is just so fraught, but so critical. We need to turn that page because it's only by turning that page that we're able to indeed, truly stand together. You know, like Pastor Mark and I, one shoulder, we're conjoined twins. To be able to stand together, Jew and Christian, and declare a message that I earnestly believe can transform the whole world.
I really believe that's why people write history.
Yeah.
Look at the Palestinians, their view of history. But anyway, no, go ahead. That's all I have to say. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I number one, just want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. Because
I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
it's a
very,
conversation.
really, seriously, I'm
that
very
needs-
grateful.
Conversation that needs to be had, and I'm grateful and appreciative of it, because your main mission and goal is building that bridge.
Yes.
And the question that I have is in Genesis 12:3. Abraham says, Hashem says to Abraham. Okay. Hello. There you go.
Oh,
All right. Abraham is promised that I will bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you.
Yeah.
Then he says, "V'nivrachu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adamah." Right? You will be blessed.
Well, all the families of the earth will
All
be
the
blessed.
families will be blessed in you. Right? So that word v'nivrachu is also has another meaning, another connotation of lehavrich, meaning to be grafted in. So all of the families, we could interpret this to say that all the families of the earth will be grafted into Abraham, through Abraham. So if we're building bridges, what did Hashem mean by the families will be grafted in? How do we define this word lehavrich? How is one grafted in?
Okay, so I do need to note, very much apropos of what we said in discussing the meaning of Notzarim in Jeremiah, that lehavrich, in the sense of grafting, is post-biblical Hebrew. It's important to draw that distinction. There are a number of levels in which we understand that interaction between the biblical Hebrew and post-biblical Hebrew. The root, barech, meaning bless, is etymologically related to berech, which means knee, because the submission of getting down on one's knees in blessing. And I think the etymology of lehavrich, in the sense of grafting, as in grafting a tree, is because you're like making a knee in the branch and bringing it back down into the earth in order for it to produce a new tree. So just in terms of the etymology, it's important for us to bear that in mind. Simultaneously, I do very keenly appreciate this idea of grafting in, and of course, I also appreciate where it's coming from in Romans chapter 11. The way I'd like to begin my response is by citing a much later work, a work that on manifold planes has profoundly influenced my philosophy. One of the classics of Jewish philosophy of the medieval period, the Kuzari by Rabbi Judah Halevi, composed roughly around 1140. An extraordinary idea that the rabbi presents in the Kuzari is when he speaks of the roles of, full disclosure, both Christianity and Islam as disseminating core principles of Torah in order to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. But he does so by employing an extraordinary parable, which to me is very poignant. You place a seed in the ground, and for all appearances, the seed decomposes and disintegrates and is no more. But you know that's not what's happening. What's happening, in fact, is not that the seed has disintegrated and become more earth, but exactly the opposite. The seed is germinating, and it's getting to work transforming all the surrounding earth to be more of it. So that when a mighty tree grows, where you place that seed in the soil, all of the surrounding earth will have become tree. Says the rabbi, so too Israel goes into exile and seems to lose its identity and become more of the surrounding substrate. But in fact, the world is being transformed. And indeed, it's hard for me to imagine that he was writing this without being aware of Romans chapter 11, which he very well may have been. This is the process of transforming all of the earth so that all the earth comes to God. And indeed, it is in that vein that we talk about to serve him with one shoulder. Full disclosure, this verse in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, I didn't get to on my own. I had a helper. It wasn't Rabbi Judah Halevi, who lived from roughly 1075 to 1141. It was a slightly more recent author, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, who lived from roughly 1138 to 1204. And tantalizingly, Maimonides, in his Code of Jewish Law, the last two chapters of which pertain to the Messianic era, enunciates the same idea that Rabbi Judah Halevi had around the generation and a half before. A tantalizing question is whether he was influenced by Rabbi Judah Halevi. The jury's out. It's not clear that he had access to the book. But it could be very simply an idea that was bouncing around at the time. And he also enunciates this idea, and he quotes the verse from Zephaniah. And what I feel compelled, of course, to merely append as a postscript on them both is, just consider when they were writing. Rabbi Judah Halevi was writing in the early part of the 12th century. We mentioned when the First Crusade entered Jerusalem in 1099, slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the city. There's an extremely moving elegy that he wrote. He was a poet that very much seems to have been specifically about the fall of Jerusalem by the hand of the Crusaders. And of course, again, he's living in Reconquista Spain, and the Jews are always in the vice between the Christians and the Muslims, and everyone is persecuting them. And he still has this vision of a world in which Christians and Muslims are going to be helping to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. And if you ask me what grafting in means, to me, his metaphor really hits the nail on the head. In other words, on the one hand, I'm going to be completely candid with you. For us, we see that in terms of the dissemination of the tradition pertaining to the Noahide covenant. And if I could bring another player into the arena here, a much more recent author, well, recent by that standard, Rabbi Jacob Emden, who lived in the 18th century, who wrote an extraordinary essay on Christianity, which he published in 1757 and in somewhat expanded form in 1758. I never saw anything like it. Written in erudite rabbinical Hebrew, indeed buried as an appendix to a scholarly work. It is an essay that quotes copiously from Christian scriptures in order to bolster his essential thesis, which is that Jesus, Paul, he focuses upon the two of them, but by extension all the apostles, had a dual agenda to reinforce observance of the Torah and the commandments among the Jews, and to create a new religion that wasn't essentially new in order to institutionalize keeping the Noahide covenant for the Gentile world. Among many other passages, he quotes the words of James in Acts chapter 15, that what we will demand of the Gentiles is, and he gives a partial listing, which Rabbi Emden says we may surmise is intimating the Noahide commandments, which, in brief, the Noahide commandments are 6 prohibitions that are intended to sanctify, make holy our lives on the 3 basic planes of human existence. With respect to our fellow man, a prohibition on stealing and a prohibition on murder. With respect to the transcendent, a prohibition on paganism, on idolatry, on worshiping something that is not God, and a prohibition on blasphemy, cursing God in God's name. And with respect to ourselves, our own inner world, the 2 drives through which a human being can debase himself and behave like an animal: the drive of self-preservation, to eat, and the drive to preservation of the species, sex. So with respect to the former, a prohibition on eating a limb torn from a living animal, and with respect to the latter, a prohibition on forbidden sexual relationships. These are the 6 Noahide prohibitions. There's a 7th to enforce the other 6. And posits Rabbi Emden that Jesus and the apostles, and most of all Paul, because he was the apostle to the nations, are enunciating the message of Christianity to the Gentile world as means to rope them in to this basis of spiritual living. Now, I feel it's imperative for me to append to this observation 2 critical postscripts. Number 1, I remember a very, very dear friend of mine who was the founder of Christians for Israel in the Netherlands, which he's passed on to the other world in the interim. He was an elderly man. But, saying to me over close to a decade and a half ago, you know, you Jews keep on talking about the Noahide commandments. I taught my children about the 10 commandments. And I said to him, well, of course you taught your children about the 10 commandments because you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You believe in the words, I am God your Lord who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. But you got to realize the Noahide covenant is intended for people who never heard of any of that stuff. It's not the ceiling, it's the foundation of spiritual living. And of course, to that extent, one is not only allowed, but in some sense enjoined to see it as a foundation and build upon it and instill more and more of life with spiritual content. And simultaneously, the second postscript that I need to add is the Noahide covenant by itself doesn't have religious institutions in it. And, you know, full disclosure, I've had the experience of addressing Christian groups, and at some point, like in the intermission, this especially has happened to me in the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands, you know, you always, whenever you speak in the evening, there is one cardinal rule that you must observe, and that is coffee break. The Dutch drink more coffee than any other people per capita, just so you'll know. And during the coffee break, folks come over to me and they say they're Noachites. Why do we have to talk to Christians? Why can't I just talk to Noachites? And I say, excuse me, but Christianity, in my belief, is an expression of what I'll call being a Noachite. I know the term Noachite has a very fraught connotation, especially here in the U.S., because it implies a kind of anti-Christian bias. I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in the sense of Noah and his sons, Noah and his children, all of humanity. All of humanity is summoned to come to God. And what I stress to them is Christianity establishes a religious institution in order to come to God. So I'm always telling Christians, you should feel a tremendous debt of gratitude to Jesus, because if it weren't for him, you'd probably be a bunch of pagans today.
And I agree with that 100%. One last postscript from me, and then I'll hand the mic off. And then time for a break, because we're going to ask you more questions at coffee. If you mentioned Acts 15 about the 4 Noachide laws that were
6.
given.
Yeah, he mentions 4, right?
Yeah,
3 or 4, depending on how you understand what he
got
writes.
a little joke, says do the 4 and no more. But
he doesn't. He says, as for the rest of the Torah, the Jews are reading it every Sabbath in the synagogue.
in the synagogue, not in the church on Sunday, but in the synagogue on Shabbat. That was the point I was going to make.
Absolutely,
He says
100%.
you can do the 4, but you know what? Come on to the Kehillah, come on to the congregation, and we're going to teach you more, and you will learn more and more as you grow and learn and understand.
But I'm still going to say, but you're not obligated.
That's right. I agree
Right.
with that.
Okay. So we're on the same page. That is, there's certainly, and again, I'm going to reiterate. When I say it's the foundation, it's not the ceiling. There is no ceiling. 100%.
How close can a Gentile draw to the Torah?
As close as he wants.
All the way. Amen.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that.
But as a votive act, don't make it into an obligation.
Yes.
The reason it's so important to not make it into an obligation, first of all, is because it's not. We have to be honest. But more importantly for me, because I know Christians who will say that every Gentile has to keep Shabbat, and that's making a whole lot of God-fearing Christians who don't keep Shabbat into sinners, and that's not true.
I think what that was going on in the book of Acts, the Jewish disciples were saying this is the minimum to come fellowship with us. And this was the foundation.
Right.
Many Christians today think that's all they have to do and they're in, as if they're not obligated to do anything else. But
So again, I'll say it's true they aren't obligated, but it's not like there's any kind of glass ceiling or
right.
closed door.
It didn't say anything about not killing in that. It didn't say anything about a lot of things.
Right.
Well, let's take a quick break and we'll be back in a half hour.
Okay. That's good, right?